In this video, I'm adding the logic to FractionInput for tokenizing and parsing the user input string. It needs to extract the numerator, the denominator, the sign from the string, and if it's a mixed number, it also needs to extract the whole number part. So there's a couple different ways it could parse. I cut out a bit of coding between this video and the last one because last night I tried to write this freestyle, but I was just flailing and I was tired. So I went back to the drawing board and planned out how I was going to do it in a way that makes sense. It's really helpful to actually plan your stuff out when it's more than a little complicated. I like to draw it out with flowcharts. So the plan is to have a few functions that advance the index of where in the string has been parsed so far, and they are going to return values and update the index. So they need to receive the index as a pointer, and I just needed to review C++ pointers a little bit because I'm a noob at C++, so I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know the exact syntax in terms of where to use the ampersand and where to use the star operators for pointers. I'm writing the various token parser functions as local functions in the fraction.cpp file rather than methods of the FractionInput class. They're general parsing functions, not relying on FractionInput members, so they don't need to be methods themselves. It's possible they could wind up in a utility.cpp file or similar in a future refactor, which would best be done after I figured out which functions I actually need. So a big function I'm going to need is the extract next assigned int function, which is going to parse through the string and find a possible sign indicator and then a possible integer. And I'm just writing comments that are indicating the same stuff I had already mapped out on my flowchart for how I wanted this function to operate. Skip white space is a pretty standard function. It's probably been written a million times by a million people. It just skips over white space in the string and updates the index. I do miss a pretty key step here that catches me later, which is that I forget to update the tested character to the next character in the string. Extract next possible sign, skips leading white space, and checks the next character to see if it's a plus or minus sign, returns true if it's a plus, false if it's a negative, advances the index to skip over that sign indicator, and if it finds a number, it returns true without advancing the index. Extract next signed int is going to figure out whether the int should be positive or negative using the extract next possible sign function. Skip white space, figure out where the number input ends, take a substring from using that end index, and then it uses stoi, which throws a couple exceptions, but will parse a string to an integer. Those exceptions will be used for printing errors. I also need a find possible div sign function, which is looking for the slash divider between a numerator and a denominator of a fraction. How this function affects parsing depends on where the div sign is. If the user inputs a mixed number, the div sign will be the third token, and if it's a regular fraction, then it would be the second token. Of course, if the user just inputs a whole number, then there will be no div sign. So ultimately the logic will have to account for that, but this find possible div sign function simply return true if there's a div sign, and it'll advance the index, and false if there isn't, and it won't advance the index because this function will have to be called in a few places in the program. Here I'm taking my first swing at writing the branching logic for parsing through the string using all those functions, putting it all in a try and catch block so that if stoi fails to parse an integer, that exception is just caught, an error is shown, program doesn't break. But of course, writing kind of complicated branching logic like this, it seems to me that it never is quite right the first try. On the first test run of this big branching logic thing, I'm seeing the errors get thrown from the stoi exceptions, meaning something's going wrong with the parsing process, obviously. With my debug print statements, I can see that the end index is always the same as the start index in the substring, so that's creating a problem. It has to do with how the index is advancing. Eventually I noticed that the skip white space function isn't actually updating the tested character, so it's always just advancing the index until the end of the string. So I spent some time tracking down this bug where I needed to simply add 1 to the index rather than increment it, and I'm not entirely sure why this wasn't working before, but it seems to all have gotten fixed by just incrementing it in a different way. The last feature I wanted to add was to have the cursor blink when the fraction input widget is selected so that the user knows that that's where they're inputting. Normally for the program the cursor is turned off, so I'm just using a couple macros to turn it back on for the duration of fraction input blocked for input function. Last thing for the coding sesh is to update the to-do list so I can remember what the heck I was doing when I come back to it tomorrow.